Hello, this is part 3 in the series examining Core 7, which is one of the cornerstones, you could say the keystone argument in regards to lost ancient high technology. There are a few but Core 7 is so important to the whole argument of granite cores because the people who promote that this is lost ancient high technology focus on the features of Core 7 and whether it's the tapering, the deep grooves, the polishing, and all these other so-called signature smoking guns of lost ancient high technology. Core 7 is the one that they focus on. All the features of Core 7 will therefore explain all the others as well. So that's why if you get rid of Core 7, you get rid of the entire argument in regards to that. Part 1 was looking into the tapered core, proved that hand tools were used. Again, links in the description. I'll link other videos that have shown it. I've done all my own experiments as well, and those are linked in the description, and this one as well, where you can do it for yourself in a very short time. It's very cheap, very easy to do. You just a couple of hours a day. By the end of the week, you'll have several of your own cores, and you'll have tapered cores and these other features as well. So those, it's not just on like, you don't need to trust me in regards to these things. You can do them very cheaply, very easily, and you will get the same results that I got, and the same results of mine were ones what previous experiments have done. It's science, repeatable, testable experiments get the same results, proven. It's a theory. Second part was deep grooves. Are these some sort of mystery? Well, no, it's not a mystery at all in regards to deep grooves. The answer was very simple. It's just to use larger grit size. I also touched on the argument because Flinders Petrie, who studied Core 7, and the arguments that he made in regards to there, well, Petrie was wrong that you needed a fixed point. So that's what the copper drill copper will absolutely drill into granite. You don't need diamond. You don't even need emery or corundum. What you need is granite dust or sand or crushed quartz. But so again, Petrie was those arguments by Petrie, he was incorrect. The one he was arguing with Alfred Lucas was correct. You can make these with loose free abrasive, been proven by multiple experiments. So depth of the grooves, the helical spiral, that will come feature as well. It's going to get the same treatment, and the polished surface. So depth of the grooves, that's no issue at all. And so what about the polished surface? If you see a close up here, so you see those deeper grooves, and sorry, you can see the reflection, so it has a polished surface. And I think that, well, it's inside the grooves and on the place between the grooves. Now, is this some sort of evidence? Well, spoiler alert at the end, we'll go into that, and again, links in the description of how you can do it. It's not just about can I explain it. Better yet, it can be demonstrated with quick, cheap, and easy experimentation. Super easy, barely an inconvenience. So I'm not arguing against the old claim that has been abandoned. We can see these are, I get recommended to watch these very popular videos, and they're very recent as well. So this is not outdated information. It's impossible with primitive and or modern technologies. Therefore, it must be lost, advanced, high technology machining. This is a very lucrative industry, and the exact same examples and arguments made by ancient lost high technology are those exact made by ancient aliens. Now they differ in who they say is responsible, but the arguments are the same. It can't be lifted. The same artifacts are used as examples. The same claims. It's impossible with copper. It's impossible with this. It's impossible. Therefore, so even though they might differ, they do remain the same. But again, with these upcoming tours where they're going to point at stones and say impossible. Lost ancient high technology, mysteries of ancient high technology. Lost technology is evidence of high technology essential for advanced claims. In their works, in their videos, they make definitive claims, as in precision to this many thousandths of an inch. Or I'm not verbaling them. These are the things they say. They say it's impossible. Very clear-cut statements, definitive statements. Now there might be other arguments in subjective matters on why or when or how, but when they say it's impossible, which is the cornerstone of what it's impossible, therefore it has to be, well, and the tools do not exist in the archaeological record, that type of thing. Well, once that's done, there is no argument. If it is impossible and we've primitive tools and techniques, that's a strong argument. But zero experimentation, repetition of things that they know to be false, and zero experimentation for all that money. Absolutely, just to be clear, I'm not straw manning them. Their videos, their books, their tours are very clear in the statements, definitive statements they make. Not the subjective issues, the definitive technical arguments. Whether it's Lost High Technology or the Ancient Aliens Industry, Chris Dunn features prominently. As we can see there with an upcoming tour, the book Lost Technologies of Ancient Egypt, something like the Bible, all these others who just, this is, you just need to read this, it's been proven that, got to watch this, got to read this. So that's the source of it. Just to be clear, I have never heard Christopher Dunn claiming ancient aliens built ancient sites. However, he is featured in the Ancient Alien series and presented as an expert in that sense. So, for instance, this episode, the Pumapunko stone blocks, he does make definitive statements like it cannot be done with primitive technologies. It cannot be done with the tools, materials known to be used in the ancient times. Impossible. So, and which is the underlying argument to all of it. It's impossible, therefore, lost ancient advanced high technology, or it's impossible, therefore, ancient aliens. So, this episode, polished surface again. So this does, whether it's lost high technology of a lost civilization or ancient aliens had to do it, they do share the same thing, which is to say impossible. This has not been abandoned. These are features now. Lost Technologies of Ancient Egypt by Christopher Dunn. Here is his official website, and I'll link the page because he talks about Core 7. And he also shows this particular experiment, which I mentioned in episode 1, which I just do not believe that this was done as was claimed. The results are just obvious. I think this forms part of a larger pattern. But in essence, he got a piece of red granite, 2¼ inch drill, chiseled a shallow groove, and then apparently operated it by hand, as he claims. But just the fact that he chiseled out that groove, well, anyway, that's for the previous episode, part 1, but the important point here is then I poured silicon carbide 80 mesh grit into the groove, and having my hands in contact with the drill assembly was beneficial, as I was able to feel when fresh grit was needed, as it didn't take long for the grit to wear down to nothing but dust. To remove the old grit and waste from the round slot, I had the benefit of compressed air. So he's putting 80 mesh grit, we'll explain that in a moment. Then he worked it, and he would not allow the grit to wear down before blowing it out and replacing the waste with compressed air. And just the fact alone that after he reached 1/4 inch, he then switched to a diamond tool. I guess if he was if he was challenging the copper abrasive and sand method, which he claims that he's dispelled. Well, you can't switch to a diamond hole saw and then drill and then go back. Okay, so even if it was conducted as he claimed, it's a terrible experiment and invalid. But again, I don't believe he did that as he claimed. Now later in that page, same page, he shows the finished core, which has, okay, I won't get into tapering, covered that earlier. And there we see the hole. And we have this chapter, but I'll just highlight another feature that was evident as a result of my drilling experiment, and which also serves to dispel the copper and abrasive theory and the ultrasonic theory, which is his, okay, but was the finish on the surface of the core of the hole and core. When using sand or any other abrasive to remove material, what other finish would we expect other than a sanded finish? The surface finish on the granite using abrasive method is unlike the surface finish on Core 7 or on the holes ancient cores came out of. So when using sand or any other abrasive to remove material, what other finish would we expect other than a sanded finish? Well, ponder that for a moment. So we go back. The experiment, I poured silicon carbide 80 mesh grit into the groove. I was able to feel when fresh grit was needed. Didn't take long for the grit to wear down to nothing but dust. To remove the old grit and waste from the round slot, I had the benefit of compressed air. So he's putting in 80 mesh grit. When it gets ground down, he's blowing it out, putting in fresh grit. So Christopher Dunn's core, the single experiment in the history of lost ancient high technology, has a sanded or a rough finish, unlike the polished surface of core 7, therefore evidence of some lost high technology. You put in 80 mesh grit as the abrasive. When the abrasive become ground down into finer particles, you removed it and added fresh new 80 mesh grit. Okay, I'm sure some of you are already going, oh, okay, triple facepalm, cringe. Now, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an experienced master engineer, craftsman, with working in the aerospace industry, but I do know this when I see it. And that's what this is. 80 mesh grit in, gets ground down, blows it out, puts in fresh stuff, and then he's surprised that it's sanded. So let's go to a moment. International Gem Society, gem cutting, abrasives, grit, mesh, and micron. So let's look at what people who do polishing actually say and what they do. So, okay, sapphire, by the way, is rubies and sapphires. Diamonds are made of carbon. Rubies and sapphires are made of aluminium oxide, which is the same material that makes up corundum or emery. Emery is just aluminium oxide corundum that's been mixed with other minerals. But how do gem polishers work? Well, we begin at 220. Commonly used for charging copper laps. Copper laps just a plate that they use to polish gems, and I'll show you. Okay, so here we have the grits that are used by gem polishers, and gems are essentially stones, but 225. Now, even at 600, used for charging copper laps. 2,800, seldom used. 3,000 grit is commonly used. 8,000 grit. This is my standard pre-polish for sapphires and other hard materials. Pre-polish, okay, 8,000 grit. 14,000. This is the standard. Now, 14,000 grit is 1 micron. There are 1,000 microns in a millimeter. Down here at 25, 800. The width of those particles is 25 microns. 25 microns is the smallest piece of dust you can see with the naked eye. Okay, then we go up to 60,000 grit. So seldom used. 50 is more common and used for polishing sapphire and other hard materials. 100,000 grit. That's 1/4 of a micron. 4,000 of those would have to be lined up to make 1 millimeter. Very fine and not often used commercially, mainly for contest cutting or hobby cutters. But these are the type of grits that gem polishers use. Now, we can sort of line them up. And the gem polishing, like 225 grit, was their standard. Now I have 120, 80, and 40 in here. So a copper lap, that's how the gem, they're using 600 to 225. That's just to prepare the plate for polishing later on. 40 grit, let's begin at 40. Now 40 grit, most hardware stores, that's the very coarse, as they define it, for for home use, for wood, timber, sort of molded, painted surfaces. 40 grit, that's the coarsest you're going to get from most hardware stores, the roughest sandpaper. 80 grit is pretty much the coarsest emery board, nail file that you'll get. 240 is the smoothest, the finest nail file, and that's different from what they'll use for polishing. Okay, they put in that perspective. Vellus hair, peach fuzz, baby hair is approximately 110 to 150 microns. So that puts it around 120 grit. 360 to 400. Again, UK versus US standards are slightly different, but just say between 400 to around 500, 600 is the finest dust particles that you'll see. Okay, but how to polish? So how to polish a newly painted car? Well, again, now we're going to look into how things are polished and what type of grit size they use. But again, the roughest sandpaper you're going to get is around 40. A very smooth nail file is around 240, and then like to 600 up to 1,000, 1,500. Okay, but let's how do people polish? This is easy information, very easy to find, and of course, experienced people in industrial manufacture, high school students who have done industrial arts, metal shop, wood shop. This is just simple, basic knowledge. Okay, polishing a new car. So pause to read, but how do they polish paint? Well, they use sandpaper, and they begin with a 1500 grade grit, which is about 13 microns, 1200 minimum, and work up to 3000 grit. We're looking at about 6 microns in size. Some sites recommend starting with a paper as low as 400 grade, but do not do this. Anything under 1200 is going to cause more damage than what it solves. Including, well, okay, so polishing, well, I'm not a panel workshop, but I know just by the basic experience you use a smooth sandpaper to get a smooth result. You don't use a rough paper to get a smooth result. It's not rocket science. So they're using a very fine grit, between 13 to like 7 microns. 80 grit is 177 microns. Massive difference there. Even at 400, so between 360 to 400, which again is 25 microns, that's pretty much the smallest particle you can see with a naked eye. That's considered rough in regards to polishing. So how to polish granite? Just, you get a decent finish at 800 grit, which is somewhere between there. So we're looking, standards vary, but around about 20 to 15 micron. But as you move to grit 1500 and 3000, mirror-like finish should be evident. So there we see honed granite, which has been polished down to a flat surface. But the abrasive would still, I've done some videos where I show how to do this. Again, very easy to create a perfectly flat surface on granite just using sand, granite dust, or other abrasives. Very simple. It's basically rub them against one another. But if you want a polished surface without applying a polishing agent, you have to use very fine grit, 1500 to 3000. So just like the gem polishers are using, just like the car body painters are using. So to get, again, polish, you're looking at a very fine grit. It's certainly not, you're not going to get any sort of polish at 80 grit. Metal polishing. So what you have there, this mill finish, and then if you want a really nice polish on a metal surface, so if you can still feel the scratch lines, use 320 grit, and then make good use of your time. Work your way up to between 1500 to 2000 grit if you want to polish metal. Again, you're not going to be using 80 grit to polish metal. Like you start at 320 if you want to get a really high polish. That's just to remove the scratches you can feel. Okay, at 320 you're still going to be getting scratches. If you want a high polish, you need to work up to 1500 to 2000 grit size. This is metal polishing. This is a type of thing you learn in high school in metal shop industrial arts classes. And just as a reminder, 1 micron, 1000 microns is 1 millimeter, which is 0.03937 inches. So there's your grit sizes. Starting at around 1000 and below, or higher than that, so smaller and smaller particles, that's your polishing finish. Where you have sort of this intermediate area around 600. Even like at 800 you still get a reasonable finish, but polish. But even at 25 microns, you're going to get a rough milled sand finish. So everything above that line is going to be rough, sanded, milled finish. Everything below is going to be polished. Christopher Dunn. Decades of experience in industrial manufacturing, machinists. Okay, he used an 80 grit. Doesn't allow the grit to get worn down. Surprised it does not have a polished finish, therefore lost high technology. Impossible to achieve. 80 grit. That's the coarsest emery file. Like to put it that way, it's the coarsest nail file you can get. Now, of course, that's going to leave a rough finish. It's well above the polishing line and well inside the rough surface line, and he knew that 80 grit was becoming finer and intentionally removed it. So, like, is he set up to, we being trolled, or did he set up to fail? There is no way He must know this. You don't in high school industrial arts you learn this type of stuff, let alone decades of experience in aerospace and so forth. So literally, an experienced machinist uses 80 grit, regularly cleans it out to stop it going into a finer grit, and then is surprised he gets the sanded finished rather than a polished one, therefore lost high technology. I find this hard to believe. Now that's either like, Dunning-Kruger in this field, or gross incompetence. That's the charitable explanation. Like, whether if you're dealing in industrial manufacturing, aerospace, you would have to know this. You would absolutely, this would be the air that you breathe in that type of industry. Occasional hobbyists know these types of things. I couldn't tell you what the particles was in each grit, but I knew rough sandpaper is going to give you a rough result, and you want that really fine stuff to sand down wood, to sand down metal, to sand down a painted surface. It's not rocket science. You cannot be serious that this is presented in that way. It's beyond belief. If I said that to my industrial arts teacher in high school, I would have had chalk thrown at me. Sir, I'm using 80 grit, but I keep getting an 80 grit finish instead of a polished one. This is, wow. Like, really, so again, these are his quotes from his book. Another feature was evident drilling experiment, which dispels the copper and abrasive one. Okay, using sand or any other abrasive to remove material, what other finish would we expect other than a sanded finish? The surface finish on granite using abrasive method is unlike the surface finish on core 7. Okay, polishing is done with abrasives, just a very fine abrasive. Of course, a coarse grit like 80 grit won't leave a polished surface, it will leave a rough sanded one. Like, wow, really? This is, this is trolling, okay? There is no way that this could not be known, could not be predicted. You wouldn't have even had to physically done the experiment. Just high school level industrial arts metal shop, wood shop would tell you you could predict this result without even any fear of being proven wrong. Just a reminder, this is still valid in 2020. Polish, like, in 2020 the internet was still around, but with decades of experience in aerospace, master craftsman machinist who likes to poo-poo everyone else, and everyone, wow, nah, man, come on. No, this is beyond cringe. This is way out there. This is out there in cuckoo land at this point, to be surprised that 80 grit is going to give you a polished surface and give you a sanded surface rather than a polished one. Come on, Mr. Dunn. Wow. Speechless is that this could even be presented by a hobbyist that would argue this, let alone someone who uses the appeal from authority. No. That's cringe. Okay, now let's examine the next part. But like, this is what they actually say. I'm not, this is Monty Python-esque to use 80 grit, clean it out regularly, and then be surprised you got a sanded finish. Like, is this trolling at this point? I mean, like, are we being trolled? Wow, man, come on. Oh, speechless. I have no speech. This paper will be linked in the description, of course. It's often cited, used as, by the Core 7 must be lost high technology because impossible, therefore lost high technology. Linked in the description. Now, this paper never attempted to recreate Core 7 or ancient Egyptian cores in general. It did seek to resolve the question of the argument of loose abrasive promoted by Alfred Lucas versus a fixed point abrasive argument of William Matthew Flinders Petrie. That was shown in more detail in the last part. It showed that Petrie was wrong. It also examined the marks left by different types of abrasive on red granite under different drilling conditions with a copper pipe, all of them, but dry versus lubricated in water or in some form of oil. in the paper here is an important feature of a functional analysis. Basically, they lay out what they were trying to do, how they did it, and this is the important feature here. You can read the whole paper in link in the description. The size of the abrasives varied from 60 to 90 grit and 240 grit. That's an important feature. Now, drilling was effected at a constant rotational speed of 1000 RPM and held intermittently at relatively constant pressure. Some drilling was done with brace and bit in an oscillating, i.e. back and forth manner, and some with a bow drill. But the main feature, what they detail, is that different abrasives, but using constant rotational speed of 1000 RPM held intermittently at a relatively constant pressure. So the abrasives were between 60 and 240, so even by, of course not going to get a polish. There's the pictures of some of their results. Now we see this was done by wet sand, and the cut marks are different now. B, the abrasive used was emery, and abrasions on the inner and outer walls. You can see the outer walls, the inner walls is a little bit dark. So for instance there you can see the inner walls of C, but emery was used wet with olive oil or with modern lubricant. And so whether it was done, this is when they were done wet. Now we have C. The abrasion used was corundum. Now emery is corundum, so it's just basically aluminium oxide that has mixed with other minerals. Pure corundum has the same similar. We'll look at that in a moment, but essentially it's the same thing, but there will be a slight variation because there are other abrasives in there, and they will have a slightly different effect. But so this one, the abrasive used was corundum. Finding similar to that of emery was evident because, well, it's essentially the same thing. And this was done using diamond. Finding similar to that by both emery and corundum, and they also pointed out that diamond, whether wet or dry, left these type of scratch marks. So that's what they're all really doing in this experiment. And again, they're very tiny cores. You can see they're under magnification. They're not a large core. It was done, in a lab just to look under the microscope and see the features. So okay, that's core 7, and these don't really look anything too much like core 7. But the important part is the drilling was effected at a constant rotational speed of 1000 RPM. So it was done with a hand drill. You're not going to get 1000 RPM. Okay, even with a flywheel drill at my top speed, and I'm getting pretty good at it, is 400 RPM. They did it with a modern tool. So core 7 tapered, okay, but these were done with a modern. So of course they don't look like core 7. If you just read the methodology, what they were trying to do, how they did it, it just you can't compare, use this as any sort of evidence or say this is evidence for a smoking gun. It's just no, way out there. One versus the other. We already showed that core 7, the taper, is proof of primitive techniques. So I have to ask, did they even read the paper? It's 8 pages long, and a lot of that is just pictures. It even suggests possible further experiments, such as comparing the difference between the grooves left by iron instead of copper tubular drill. So again, just getting emery, sand, diamond, or pure corundum, and examining what different materials would leave different marks. So instead of copper, just repeat it with iron. So again, it even suggests an experiment that could have been done. But back to, now the polishing. Now, can we do this? Yes, we can. Okay, core 7, there we see one of the examples done. Scientists Against Myth channel is where you can find a video going into this. They also show how to do it. Now, I'll also link in the description. I've made long, boring videos of me explaining how to drill and the techniques to do that. You'll find those in the description as well. You can repeat this very cheaply, very, very easily if you have, for those who claim, to have the, well, they're making money, and but if they claim to have half the, if they claim to have 1% of the interest that they do in these things, they would have just gotten off their rear ends and done something in all these years and all the money and all the countless hours of travel, stone pointing, like, yeah, where, you can't really be that interested unless you're trying to protect your narrative, of course. So it was the Scientists Against Smith. I'd been planning to do it for a while, but they really, once I saw their flywheel drill technique, that really, put a fire under my backside to get into it. Also the event of 2020, with everything that went on with there. So, everything's closed, there's nothing going on. So I had plenty of time, but I basically spent 2 hours a day actually drilling, and within 2 weeks I had quite a collection of granite cores going. So again, a very small investment, very easy material. So it's basically a copper tube from the hardware, offcuts of granite bench tops. I also had a couple of, I suppose you call them little boulders of granite in the garden there to do experiments. So I got red, grey, black. Also not pictured here, I did some in limestone, and there's a couple there in marble as well. It's like a few hours a day over a couple of weeks. I mean, okay, it's not that hard or that for those who have a profession behind this. Featured again, Ancient Aliens has History Channel. What sort of budget do they have? They have assistants and everything. Why the hell can't they have ever done this? Well, because it's a house of cards, because once you pull one out, everything collapses down. And so it's just important for them to keep saying impossible, impossible, impossible. The income will follow through. As soon as they say, well, okay, let's actually do something productive, instead of time wasting, bordering on fraud in some cases. Well, okay, there's the answer. So here's 2 examples of cores that are made in red granite, and we'll have core 7, Scientists Against Smith channel, Alexander Sokolov channel as well, and also you can find their website in that paper I showed earlier. But what's going on here? So these are from exactly the same piece of red granite. One has a sanded finish, one has a polished finish. Now, this one I used 40 grit, so that was the roughest sandpaper that I could find in the local hardware. I used aluminium oxide, but this was done also with 30% white quartz, where I just got those ornamental white rocks you'll see in garden beds and that type of stuff. Broke that down into a powder, small grit actually, and then I just drilled with a copper tube. Now, although I began with small little rocks or grit, I kept adding new grit, but I never replaced the old one. So there you can see it eventually ground, the 40 grit ground down into a very fine slurry, very fine powder, and it gave me a polished finish. This one was done with 100% corundum using large grit, but I just regularly cleaned out, as soon as that grit, the crunchy sound, you'll see that in the videos how to. As soon as that crunch started to reduce to a less crunchy crunch, I washed it all out and I put in new corundum. So, and very, very large. I think would be about 10 or 15 on the grit scale. So they're little tiny rocks. You wouldn't even call it grit. And I got a sanded finish. Now, that's those same 2. I've just to highlight the striations, because the purpose of this, I wasn't even trying to look at the sanded versus polished finish. I was looking at the pattern left by the grooves, examining the alleged helical spiral in these. And so there you see one with a very fine grit, and just a chalk just to hide, it makes it more evident. And here you can see the very deep grooves, and so the high points and the low points. Now this will be for the next video. Examining the spiral is this. Well, that'll be for the next one. And I did the same thing. So I got 2 pieces. So that's black granite, one with a fine grit, one with the very, very, very coarse grit, where I kept washing it out and adding new stuff as soon as it went down. Again, the red, that's those 2 examples of red, and I also did it in grey granite. So looking at different types of granite, Now all of them I used, with the exception of this one, which was 30% quartz and 70% corundum. All of these are 100% pure corundum, aluminium oxide as the abrasive. And we'll examine maybe, especially that paper that talked about white quartz, but either way you can see the, so here you can, 40 grit, fine, where I just allowed it to get down finer. So those are the top three, black, red and grey, and all three on the bottom I used very, very, very coarse little rocks really of aluminium oxide, and I just kept washing them out. So you can also see the patterns, the large, the deep grooves in there, just the chalk to help examine that. So my intention wasn't even to, like, at that point I haven't even heard of the 80 grit left me a sanded finish, and like why did I like, that was a double, triple take I had to be sure of that, but it's anyway. But what you're really effectively seeing is, so this experiment by the scientists against Smith and that paper which I showed, where have the deep grooves, but they also have the polished surface, just like a Core 7. And in these two, what you're really seeing is a breakdown of those two different effects. So polished surface with deep grooves, because if you add a very coarse grit, and keep adding coarser grit, as long as you don't remove the old material, as long as you're not removing it like Chris Dunn did, put in 80 grit, grind it down a little bit, then take it out and put in fresh stuff, you'll get both the polished surface, because there's that fine powder, very, very fine grit is in there polishing it, and as you add new grit, which is coarse, it's also going to leave those grooves. So I've just basically, we've broken that down into the polished part and to the deep grooves. So deep grooves, but are also polished. Case closed. There is no evidence for lost high technology. It's not impossible. Very cheap, very easy, very quick experimentation. Like literally, I spent a couple of hours a day over, not even every day, over 2 weeks, and I assembled quite a collection and got good at the drilling and knew what I was doing. I've done it. You can do it. It is very easy. Those how-tos will be in there. I'll explain some of the different features also in the last part as well. So the next part will be the alleged helical spiral, which is spoken about. Now Petri speaks of that, and again, this is presented, that'll be for the next part, but it's not much. It's about the same as the tapering, the deep grooves, and the polished surface. That's what's going to be. So yeah, that's for the next part. But what can you zero experimentation, but lots of masturbation, traveling around the world, pointing at stones, saying impossible, impossible, impossible. Everyone else is ignoring this. No one's doing any sort of work. Well, no, right back at you. Again, if you have any doubt, you can very easily, cheaply, and quickly do all these experiments. They don't cost much time or money, and you'll know for a fact that using these ancient techniques and ancient materials, that this can be done. And if it is possible, therefore the impossible, therefore lost high technology or ancient aliens argument completely collapses. No evidence, nothing's there. It's a nothing burger, as they say.